Don't touch that dial. You're tuned in to the Dread Podcast Network.
Welcome to Development Hell. For every horror movie that hits V.O.D, countless others end up D.O.A. Development Hell is the podcast dedicated to unearthing these cursed horror productions. We're going to find out what went wrong, and then decide if these titles still stand a shot at the green light. I am your host, Josh Korngut. I am the managing editor of Dread Central. I am also a filmmaker in Toronto, Canada. This podcast is a proud member of the Dread Podcast Network. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Development Hell. Today, we are diving into a zombie franchise. We are talking about the 28 Days Later franchise, but more specifically, the unmade third film, not actually titled 28 Months Later, but that's what we're going to call the episode today. We have a very special returning guest judge we have Chad Collins with us. He has joined us once before on an unmade Scream episode. Chad is a staff writer with us at Dread Central. Chad, how's it going?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad that you're back. I know I just gave a little bit of an intro to who you are, but Chad, could you do me the favor of reintroducing yourself?
Of course. So thank you so much for the introduction. I am a staff writer at Dread Central, and I additionally write for a few other sites online. I am a features writer at /film, and then I just sort of freelance at some other sites whenever the inspiration strikes.
And he's a great writer. Lots of articles to look out for, including a recent one on 28 Days Later. Am I right when I say that?
Yes. For Dread, I actually took a look at the history of fast zombies, and something we're going to touch on today, I'm sure, the sort of influence that 28 Days Later had in the early aughts and sort of revitalizing the zombie subgenre.
Definitely. Today we're going to tackle 28 Days Later, the sequel 28 Weeks Later. We are going to get a little bit into the 2000 zombie revival. We're going to end up talking about the unmade third film, which we're calling 28 Months Later. Chad, what would you say your general relationship with this franchise looks like?
So I was never much of a zombie person growing up, and I was very little when the first one released. I actually caught when 28 Weeks Later released, and I caught that first, and I really liked it. I always liked energy as a kid and a teenager. I liked movies that were very fast and very loud. That inspired me to seek out the first one, and it's definitely a very different tone and feeling to it. But I think even at the time, I recognized that this was something that I really hadn't seen before. It felt very different than the zombies I was familiar with. So from that moment forward, I just always sort of had a special respect for it.
I'm with you. I'm not exactly the number one zombie fan in the world either, but I do have a soft spot definitely for 28 Days Later and another film released, I think, the same year, Resident Evil, which I think these are two movies that are cited as causing a bit of a resurgence in the zombie realm. Are you a fan of that first Resident Evil movie?
I am. I actually, if it's okay, I have a small anecdote about that movie.
Yes, please.
I was at my friend Tyler's house, and we were having a sleepover. We were playing, actually, Resident Evil on the GameCube. I think probably the remake of the original game. And he said, "Did you know they did a movie of this?" And I said, "No way. I would know about that." And he said, "No, it's true. And my mom has the DVD." And I was like, "Okay, let's watch it." And he was like, "We have to wait until she goes to bed because it's in her bedroom in her DVD cabinet and she won't let us watch it." So we waited until his mom went to bed, and he brought it out, and we plugged it into his little DVD player in his room. And I remember that opening scene with the elevator, and I was stupid. I was in probably second grade at the time. And I remember watching that scene, and I said, "No, this isn't Resident Evil. Resident Evil has this mansion. There are zombies. It's all of this stuff. because I couldn't process what an opening scene was. And I was like, this isn't Resident Evil. You lied to me. And we didn't finish it. And I didn't rewatch it until like several years later. And
Oh
that
my
whole
God.
period of time, I thought Tyler was a liar.
Wow, fuck you, Tyler. I hope you're listening. Yeah.
Told everybody he was dishonest.
Well, that first movie really didn't. None of them really feel like the first game, which is contained in that spooky mansion. Maybe the more recent release, Welcome to Raccoon City, which I have not seen. Did that feel closer to the heart of the game for you?
It does. And I will say, in retrospect, having revisited it several times, I'm a big fan of the first Resident Evil. I like the camp. I like the action. And I think alongside 28 Days Later, I think it really did help to repopularize, the idea of zombies. So I respect it enormously.
Why do you think these two movies, or specifically even 28 Days Later, had that influence in the early 2000s?
So I would think, I think there's probably, a lot of different reasons for it. I think coming out of the 90s and having a very specific taste and style of horror in the 90s, I think even if it weren't zombies, I think audiences are always just looking for something new. And then I touched on this in the piece I did for Dread on zombies. I think definitely post 9/11, there's a big shift in audience sensibilities, and I think horror did a really good job of very quickly responding to that. And I think 28 Days Later really tapped into that almost like apocalyptic dread. It's a very dark movie. It's very dour. It's fast and it's frenzied, but it's also, there's a lot of pathos and there's a lot of human elements to it, which I think is really where the horror sensibilities were shifting. And I think zombies, just by virtue of being zombies and being almost innately apocalyptic, I think they're a really good template for filmmakers to really explore those themes more so than some other subgenres.
Chad, how would you feel if I gave a bit of a seminar on the first 28 Days Later?
That sounds wonderful.
This first film, 28 Days Later, came out in 2002. It's a British zombie horror film directed by Danny Boyle and written by Alex Garland, starring Cillian Murphy and Naomi Harris. If you had to say what this movie is about, how would you...
Oh, that's a tough one. So I would want to say it's just a really dark and poetic zombie movie. I know that there is some contention with whether or not it is a zombie movie, but I would say it's, the way I like to look at it is almost a road trip movie. You have Cillian Murphy as sort of our nexus. He's sort of our entryway, and we're just sort of following him, the different people he encounters, the survivors. It's almost like, something like The Walking Dead, which of course came much later, but sort of truncated into filmic form. You just have him traveling different landscapes, different settings, and making his way toward a very nebulous sort of survival. We don't really know what that means and what this looks like in this world, but he's just looking for some beacon of hope.
That's beautiful, and kind of why this movie bums me out so much. Yeah, I agree with how you phrased that. Of course, it centers on Cillian Murphy's character, Jim, who is this, I think he's like a bike courier that wakes up in a hospital, eventually meets another survivor of the rage apocalypse, and together they get into some trouble with some weird military types who are don't have the best intentions. Yeah, you mentioned that this has some people wondering if it's a zombie movie or if it's not. I believe director Danny Boyle has said a number of times that he doesn't consider it to be a zombie movie, but writer Alex Garland has stated that he took inspiration from Romero's Night of the Living Dead, as well as the 1951 novel The Day of the Triffids, which also kind of had a post-apocalyptic vibe to it. So 28 Days Later came out on November 1st in 2002. It was very successful, both critically and commercially. So it made about $82 million, but it was only created on a budget of about $8 million. So this was basically one of the biggest or most profitable films of 2002. Definitely one of the most profitable horror films of that year. How do you feel about people thinking, or even the creator saying, it's not a zombie movie?
Whenever filmmakers say that, I always go back to one particular interview I remember reading several years ago from Guillermo del Toro about Crimson Peak. And it was after it came out, and I love Crimson Peak. I should preface it with that. I think it's a fantastic movie. It's not especially scary, though. And I remember Guillermo coming out afterwards, after release, and saying, well, it was never intended to be. It was more of a gothic romance. When, for all intents and purposes, when you look at the movie, it's very clear that this was supposed to be a scary movie. And this was almost damage control of, well, it's not really supposed to be. When in reality, I think it was. And scary can be a lot of different things. It may not have been conventionally scary, but I don't think that undersells the horror elements you had, but it is explicitly a horror property. And for 28 Days Later, for me, it amounts to what I think zombies are. I think the zombie subgenre in recent years especially is always sort of playing around with different viruses and different infections. Sometimes they're reanimated corpses, sometimes they're not, but they serve the same sort of role. And so for me, it's easy to just conceptualize it as zombies.
Because it is. It just is zombies. It does kind of rub me the wrong way when filmmakers try to distance themselves from horror for whatever reason. Happens a lot with the Oscars. People will like to lean on the thriller label because I think it lends itself a little bit better to prestige or, highfalutin cinema. But as we know, horror can be whatever you want it to be, including a prestige zombie film. Did you ever have the DVD for this one?
I did not, no.
So the DVD was interesting. It had 3 alternate endings, and we here on Development Hell are really interested in alternate history of horror. So I thought maybe we'd do a little bit of a rundown on the 3 could have been endings for 28 Days Later. So yeah, all of these were included on the DVD extra that was originally released in 2002. And most of them concern Jim dying at the end. I think the general release for this film has a happy ending, maybe a little bit of a vague ending, but definitely like positive in tone. We see our main characters surviving. But one of the alternative endings, which was filmed, sees Jim dying of a gunshot wound. There's another where the outbreak is just revealed to be a dream, which is always a weird way to go. And then there's a third one, which they didn't really film, but they had in storyboard format. And this one, I believe we see Frank being killed. I believe we see Jim being killed by soldiers. There was a lot of controversy after the release of the film. People thinking maybe that the happy ending that was tacked on at the end wasn't really the best way to go about it. And then the US release in cinemas included one of the alternative endings after there was a bit of a debate online of which one was more appropriate. What did you think of the ending of 28 Days Later? Did it feel appropriate to you? Did you feel like it landed?
I actually like the ending they ended up going with, although I will say upon rewatching it over the weekend and then, of course, several weeks ago specifically, though, for the Dread piece, I was under the impression that Jim did die of his gunshot wounds at the end. So that's what I thought the official formal ending was. So it was a little shocking to me at the end when I said, oh, wait, he survived. And then that did inspire me to look up the alternate endings because I thought it might have been something like they had done with Neill Marshall's The Descent. And I thought maybe this was an original ending and I just have some kind of weird US specific ending because we don't like we don't like bad endings. We like very conclusive, very optimistic, happy endings here. And then I was surprised to see no, it had always been Jim surviving and that his gunshot wound was actually the alternate ending. And I thought it had been, the reverse. I think it fit though.
I like a happy ending. Whatever. I don't want to be bummed out for the rest of my life, especially if I just watched like a really intense zombie film. It's okay if it earns it, which I think it did this time around. I'm not mad at it. What was the other ending for The Descent?
So I know that in The Descent, Neill Marshall, the original ending has her stuck in the cave still and not escaping. And it was the US release that tacked on the alternate ending where she does successfully escape, which was very controversial because they actually used that alternate ending as sort of the template and the jumping off point for the sequel. Because the sequel, of course, couldn't follow the original ending that was released to UK audiences. It could only follow that alternate US ending.
Oh my God, that's kind of messy. I didn't know
People were
that.
very unhappy.
That's interesting, especially because it's not an American film. Weird.
It's
I never
like
saw the sequel. How is the sequel to The
it's
Descent?
it's got good and bad. I think it's much better than a sequel to The Descent could have been because it's The Descent. How do you
Yeah.
match The Descent? I
Uh-huh.
think it goes much better than I was anticipating. There are a lot of silly decisions, and I would say the biggest slight against it is it's very bright. I
Mm,
think The Descent really worked because Neil Marshall balanced light and dark really well. You could see just enough without it being pitch black, and they just light up The Descent Part 2. There are no shadows, no creepy corners, no hidden crevices. Everything is illuminated,
weird.
and I think that sort of jeopardizes the fear factor because it looks very much like a set. And I know they filmed on a set in the first one, but when it's this bright, you can see these rocks look like styrofoam, and this doesn't look like a real cave system right now.
Hmm. Is it still mostly woman-led?
It is not. No. I
Oh,
will say that like central protagonists are principally women. Do you mind if I spoil it? It's not much of a
please, I'm
spoiler. It
begging you.
happens in the first like 10 minutes. Juno
Do it.
survives from the first
Yes.
one.
Yes, I think I
Okay.
knew. Yeah.
So she reappears
Interesting.
and she's
Hmm.
got her little pickaxe and she's like, let's fight some humanoids.
I'll have to watch it one day. Maybe there's a third one that didn't get made that I can dip into the franchise for.
I would love
Um,
that.
yeah. Question for you, and if you don't have a specific answer to that, that's fine. But I'm wondering, do you have any favorite moments or standout characters, standout moments, things that really resonate with you from 28 Days Later?
So Naomi Harris's Selena, of course, is incredible.
Hmm.
She's of course a fantastic actor, and I like what they did with her. I think too often in zombie movies and post-apocalyptic movies, especially, they're really keen. Sometimes storytellers are on stereotyping all of the characters. You might have the really gruff, rough leader, or you have a really sympathetic character. You might have like a sort of, I don't want to say whiny, but like a whiny, weak character who from the get go isn't going to make it. And
Hmm.
I like the way that in Garland's script, he sort of plays around with that, where everybody gets an opportunity to have moments of weakness and vulnerability, but also strength. And it makes them really dynamic. And I really appreciate that because it keeps me on my toes as an audience member. And it is cool to sort of see just the vagaries of their disposition because it's new to all of them, this apocalyptic setting, and sort of exploring how everyone is responding to it and the shared humanity they have, even if they're going about it a little bit differently.
Hmm.
And also
Although you did,
Selena's coat.
uh-huh.
That Selena's
Yeah,
coat. I love that coat.
yeah. A good friend of mine runs an account called Final Girl Fashion, and the whole time I was just thinking she's gotta do an installment on this because the fashion's so good and so 2002.
It really is, man. It's
Um,
amazing.
it is. So would you say Selena's like the character you sort of resonate the most with, or your favorite of the batch?
I would say. I think a
Hmm.
lot of horror fans, I imagine, feel this way. It's always a little bit easier for me to just identify and relate to women characters sometimes. That's not to say
Me
that writ
too.
large I can't, but when you put someone like Cillian Murphy as Jim and then you have Selena, it's not to say that Jim is a bad character. I think Jim is a fantastic character. Just always easier for me in my own perspective. I'm just almost innately drawn more toward that feminine element, and
Hmm.
that's where I really latch on to.
Me too. Everywhere in horror, I'm always looking for interesting women characters, and we have a couple of them here. So, as you mentioned, we have Selena, and there's also Hannah. There's sort of a controversial plot line where they meet the main cast meets up with sort of this military group who ends up having like nefarious intentions when it comes to finding women. And I'm wondering like how you felt the script handled this. Was it like salacious, or do you think it had something to say?
I think, from my perspective, and I was actually having a really great conversation about something very similar with a recent zombie release, The Sadness, with Mary Beth McAndrews from Dread. And I like that 28 Days Later didn't make it as salacious as it could have. I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the horror inclination is to go as far as possible. And I like that there was restraint here. There was enough contextually for me to be horrified by the implications of what this was without having to see it. And so I'm glad about that. I certainly would have liked, probably, especially with Selena, a little bit more, I don't want to say agency, but a more active role in escaping
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yep.
But I do think it's a huge component of what made 28 Days Later distinct, because it incorporated this, sort of community of soldiers who had these awful intentions with repopulating. And I think it speaks to the depravity of what a world might be like in an event like this, but it did so in a way that was horrifying without feeling exploitative.
Mm-hmm. I agree, although I think it sort of towed the line, but at the end of the day was successful, especially for 2002, which was a different time. And I think
Mm-hmm.
they handled it fairly well. And I think what this first film does and the second film maybe doesn't do is handle, the depravity of humans more so than zombies. You're seeing, like, you're seeing how everything falls apart within 28 days, not just people turning into monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you see that in the second one. How would you feel if we tiptoed into the sequel?
I would love that.
So 28 Weeks Later came out, I think, about 5 years down the line in 2007. 2005, Danny Boyle mentioned in an interview that the sequel was going to feature a completely new cast because Cillian Murphy, Megan Burns, and Naomi Harris were supposedly up to different projects and could not return. So eventually the sequel to 28 Days Later came out. It has like a pretty insane cast, actually, including Robert Carlyle, Rose Byrne, Jeremy Renner, Catherine McCormick, Imogen Poots, Idris Alba, all sorts of pretty amazing people show up in this film. Maybe this time I'll try giving a little bit of a synopsis. So 28 Weeks Later, set way down the line after the first film, and it revolves around NATO military forces as they try to clean up London, or like the surrounding areas of London, as they think they've sort of defeated the rage virus. We have two young siblings who are the lead characters in this film, including Imogen Poots, and they break protocol by sort of escaping into London, and outside of their zone, they find their infected mother, who has a bit of a resistance to the rage virus, and then all hell breaks loose. Would you say that is the general sort of vibe of the film? Am I missing anything major?
I think that's a perfect synopsis.
So this film came out in the UK on May 11th, 2007 by 20th Century Fox and Atomic Fox in the US. It did pretty well. So it made about 65 million bucks against a budget of 15 million, and this was one of the sort of flagship titles from Fox Atomic. Do you remember Fox Atomic, Chad?
I did not until you reminded me of it.
Okay.
But some gems.
Very much so, some gems. So for those who may have forgotten, Fox Atomic was this sort of sublabel of 20th Century Fox in the late mid 2000s, focusing on genre titles and comedy titles. They released some very iconic late 2000s horror films, including Turistas, Hills of Eyes 2, Death Sentence, and Shudder, presumably that remake. Do you have any kind of love in your heart for any of these movies?
I have a ton of love in my heart for Turistas because I have a
Yeah.
lot of love in my heart for Melissa George.
Oh, Melissa George, truly a horror icon. One of my first news pieces I ever did for Dread was about Melissa George. She said, I think she kind of released some quote about the 4K release of Mulholland Drive. And I was writing about that and I was looking into it. And this woman is in countless incredible horror films. Like, I forgot about 30 Days of Night. Maybe Triangle isn't so incredible, but I feel like she's in that. She's just all over the place.
She is, and she's amazing.
She is amazing.
We love Melissa George over here.
Yeah. Am I forgetting any of the major Melissa George horror films? Mulholland Drive, Turistas, as you said, 30 Days
There's
of Night.
Amityville, which
Oh my
the
God, of
Amityville horror
course.
remake.
Which is
That is
good.
every
I mean, I like
bisexual
it.
person's dream because you have Melissa George and Ryan Reynolds, and it's the best of both
Yes.
worlds.
It is a bisexual cornucopia. I like that for them.
It really is.
Where's Melissa George nowadays? We want you back. If you
Maybe
left.
in
Maybe she
28 months
hasn't.
later.
Yes, and if not, then
I'm putting that
absolutely
energy
in
out there.
28 years later. Yeah, I know. I was thinking, well, we're getting very close to talking about 28 months later, but I always been thinking, like, if you do that, like, it's been so long, it's gonna have to be a period piece now. Like, when is 20 months after 2002? Like, what year is that?
We're in like 2004.
Wow, good year though. Pinnacle for pop culture. You know, what was
With the
coming out in
way
2004?
horror's going, we're gonna have Jenna Ortega as the lead in that.
I mean, I'm okay with it.
No, me too. I'm not complaining.
And I know that we shouldn't go too deep down this path, but do you think she's going to be the lead of Scream 6, or do you think they're going to keep the hierarchy that they have now?
I hope so, and I'm also hoping that they keep. Is it Sam, the older sister? I'm
Sam
hoping they keep Sam
Carpenter.
there. Yes, because I don't like the fan reaction to Sam. I think Sam is fine.
I didn't
And
love
a lot
Sam,
of
but I'm not like fuming. I'm not fuming about Sam.
see, I'm a petty person, so I want Sam in there just out of spite.
Yeah, that's fine with me. I thrive on spite. Yeah, well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what they do, and why not two? Why not two final girls? You know, there's room to play.
There's plenty of room.
Absolutely. So something that you mentioned to me before I watched this film for the first time this weekend was that the opening sequence was incredible, and boy, is it ever. For people that may have forgot, do you want to like give us a little bit of a description of what this opening sequence looks like?
Yeah. So it sort of takes us back to right after the original outbreak. So we haven't quite jumped 28 weeks later yet. And we've got Robert Carlyle's Dawn. He's with his wife, Alice, and that is Catherine McCormick. And so their daughter, they're there with 4 more survivors. They're on the outskirts. Their 2 children have been traveling abroad, so they're not with them. And a little boy shows up, and he's presumably infected, but they allow him in, and he isn't. But as is always the case, he has been tracked and followed. It reminds me a lot. I don't know if you're terribly familiar with it. That really good sort of like climax to I Am Legend, where Will Smith's character has the recognition after some rescuing and survivor stuff that he's been followed back to his compound one evening by the vampire creatures. So this little boy has been followed, and so Dawn, his wife, and the other survivors are now frantic trying to escape. Dawn's wife is Alice. She is desperately trying to help this boy, and Dawn he says, "I'm fed up." And he flees. He leaves everybody behind to be slaughtered. And he says, "I'm out." And he bolts it across a field. There's just beautiful sort of like wide shot of the zombies swarming in as he just runs. I think it captures a lot of that frenetic energy that Danny Boyle had in the first one. It's very chaotic. There's just straight running. It's energized, and he escapes via boat. And then, of course, we catch up with him. But it is such a savage way to open a movie because this man, in effect, leaves these people behind to die.
It's brutal. Kind of sad. Yeah, I didn't know what they were going for. I was really hoping that he would turn around and see his wife in the window getting, like, shredded. But of course, the wife comes along again later and plays a significant role in the story. But yeah, that opening scene is a 10 out of 10 and kind of makes this movie, it's kind of worth the price of admission alone. The one where they descend into the subway system down the escalators with all the skeletons. I don't know why that worked for me. Do you have any favorite moments in this sequel?
So I would say my favorite moments, because I don't hate this movie. It was the first one I saw. I saw it before 28 Days, so I think it has a little bit of nostalgia for me. And as a young person, of course, I noted before, things that were just big and loud. And it's definitely much bigger and much louder than 28 Days Later. And the
Mm-hmm.
cast for me really helps. Rose Byrne, I love her. I'm obsessed with her. Put her in anything, and I will be there. Give it comedy, drama. She's going to do it, and she's going to kill it. So
Mm-hmm.
I always appreciate having her pop up. I do like Jeremy Renner too. I don't know how few people feel about him. I think he's in the MCU, so maybe he's popular now. But
Yeah,
I always
yeah, that's all I think of him as is Marvel.
I do like him. And then, of course, Imogen Poots, sort of a genre icon as well, and sort of an early role. So I think the cast contributes a great deal to making this movie work for me because it does have some very striking imagery. I think it does a
Mm-hmm.
good job of sort of manifesting that same sort of inimitable visual quality that the first had. But doing it, of
Mm-hmm.
course, on a larger scale. There's a lot of, like you noted with the subway, there are a lot of gothic elements and gothic motifs that I see throughout that I really appreciate.
Mm.
It is, of course, just sort of swirling within this context of bad decisions, which I
Mm.
don't think the first one necessarily had. I mean, really, the impetus for the whole movie is predicated on two people making a very bad decision, which is always
Mm-hmm.
frustrating to me as an audience member. I never want conflict to come out of somebody just doing something kind of silly and, foolhardy. And this whole movie is sort of predicated on that.
Yes, it is. And it doesn't really just capture the heart of that first film in any way. But yeah, the freneticism is there, and some of the brutality is there too. There is the thumbs to the eyeball sequence that happens in the first film. They repeat with quite, it's even nastier this time around
Mm-hmm.
when Robert Carlyle blinds his wife. I think that was one of the grosser parts in this film. Really struck me.
Yeah.
Also, eyeball stuff is gross. I have a hard time
Yeah.
with
I
it.
don't do eyeballs and fingers are my two.
Oh, I have a hard time with fingers too. Like breaking fingers. Is that what you're alluding to?
If fingers get broken, if fingernails get like
Ugh,
taken off,
fingernails. Yuck.
like
Ah. Yeah.
anything finger or eye related, those are the two kinds of injuries I can't stomach.
I relate so much with the finger stuff. Yeah, finger breaking, I cannot do. I was even watching like an old episode of Buffy and someone's finger gets broken. And I was like, cannot do it. But yeah,
Ugh.
fingernails is the number one. I just can't. Even I have a hard time watching The Ring because I know in in the VHS, like in the actual video part, there's like a broken fingernail part. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's
Oh
too
yeah.
much for me.
Ooh.
Yuck. Can't do it. Another thing that I cannot personally watch in films are scalpings. That is just my like number one. I cannot do it. I am messed up by it. Do you have like anything?
Other
Yeah,
I'm trying to think if I've seen a scalping lately. That phrasing.
it's rare, but it does come up, and it's
Yeah,
always
I feel like
shocking and out of nowhere.
yeah, I was gonna say I don't think I've seen enough scalping, but scalping I think might be up there. I don't like things with skin either. Like skin should
Blech.
be attached.
No,
I want skin
yeah,
left
don't
on the
peel it
body.
off. Leave it
Yeah,
there, please.
I
Yeah,
don't
I
want
don't like
any
it.
skin coming off.
No, 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 definitely not. Yeah, what was there? Oh, I think the reason I have a scalping issue is, do you remember the movie Nurse Betty, starring Renee Zellweger, fully a comedy? I think
I
Greg
do.
Kinnear was in it.
I don't think I've seen it.
Yeah,
Does
it's
she
probably a
scalp
little bit
somebody in
before your
it?
time. No, but someone gets fully scalped in it by the bad guy, and we rented it, and I was a little kid, and I was like, no, never again. I cannot do it, and I
Oh
can't
god.
watch Bone Tomahawk. Have you seen Bone
Oh,
Tomahawk? Because I
bones.
hear it.
Yes, I have that.
I have not. I have not. I have not seen it. Although recently I was doing research for a list on like the most painful deaths in film history, and there was one in that came up that I was unaware of, and I'm still upset just reading about it.
Yeah, Bone
Um,
Tomahawk gets you because it's just like an hour and a half of just like easy breezy Western. There's like a little bit of violence
okay.
and conflict, but it's nothing too bad. And then you reach that conclusion and you're like, oh my God.
That's so funny. Yeah, no, I hate that. Well, I think maybe I was talking to you where I feel like the Innkeepers kind of does the same thing, but with horror and scares. Where the whole time
Yeah.
it kind of feels like it's YA fun, like low stake horror. And then the last, I don't know, 10-20 minutes is just off the charts
Yeah. They
terror.
just, everything they have been saving goes there.
Yes. And I think that's always a rotten move, but one that I always appreciate because it's ballsy.
That's why I love slow burn because I'm like, listen, I feel like you might have something really good in store for me at the end of
Yeah.
this.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Just don't bore me. You can be slow without being
Yeah.
boring. Ty West is a good example.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
before we head into 28 months later, I'm wondering, have you seen the latest Alex Garland film, Men?
No, but I will be going this week.
No, it's so funny. I have not seen it either, and I thought Chad will have seen it. He can he could fill us in. But I was wrong, and that's okay. This is what I get for assuming.
We
Yeah,
do
I'm
love
excited to see
Alex
it.
Garland over here. I am probably like one of 3 Sunshine stands.
Make it 4. I think it might be my favorite.
4.
Yeah,
I
I
am
love that movie.
obsessed with
Sunshine
that
is
movie.
Yes, I saw it in theaters without really knowing what it was going to be, and I remember being like, "Wow, fully a horror movie, space-time horror film. I love it."
It
I
should
don't
be
know
more
who wrote
popular with
it.
that cast list.
I forget who was in it.
Um,
I forget who wrote this article, but we did an article very recently at Dread Central about horror in space that has nothing to do with aliens, and I think that's just like a new favorite subgenre of mine because space
was
is
that
so
me?
scary. Was it you,
That
Chad?
might have been it might have been me. I wrote about space slashers and I think I talked about Sunshine.
Wow, it's hard to keep up these days, and that's okay. We're busy, we're booked, and we're blessed. Yeah, Sunshine's an amazing film, and Annihilation. I know it's kind of polarizing. I think it's one of my favorites of all time.
Oh, I'm obsessed
Mm,
with it. I took my mom for her
Okay, good.
birthday. It wasn't even a gift for her. I said, "I'm gonna take you to the movies."
What did she think of
She was
Annihilation?
she was not happy with me.
It's not a, I don't. Your mom seems, more game than a lot of moms when it comes to genre, but that's a tough one.
Yeah. I
That's a
think though I
toughie.
did like I sort of lied. I gave her like a little synopsis and I knew it was going to be weird. I just didn't allude to any of that. I was like, yeah, like sci-fi and there's going to be a big like bear monster and she's like, "Okay, that
Hmm.
sounds cool." And then she
All
was just like,
true.
"I swear to God."
Yeah, it's like the most cerebral major release of the last who knows how long. It's so weird. And I don't know if at the end it truly earns all of its weirdness, but it doesn't matter because it's so beautiful and unlike anything we get on a regular. Kind of
Yeah,
sad
and
we're not getting any of the follow-up novels adapted.
I can be shady and say I don't know that we need that.
I have not read any of the novels in that series. I've only seen that one film, but I
So
loved it.
Annihilation is very good. The 2 follow-ups in the Southern Reach trilogy, they get they were not for me, I will say. They're
Okay,
still
tell me why I'm
beautifully
so
written.
interested. What's going
They just
on?
get so it's been like when was that 2018? So it's been since like 2018 when I read the trilogy.
Mhm.
Um, and it gets very bizarre. There's like a paranormal element to it that is
Fun.
introduced in the 3rd one. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think birds figure in like really like centrally. They're like ghost birds.
I hate that.
It's one of those things where like you can't just like accept the shimmer. You get that whole 3rd book rundown of like, here is everything that is happening. And when you have something like you said, so cerebral and just bizarre and almost Lovecraftian, when you start to explain it, like the explanation is always going to be ridiculous.
Yeah, it's
And
never going to be earned. No.
it just gets a little ridiculous.
Was the explanation ghost birds? Because I cannot stand with that.
There were birds and there were ghosts, and I'm like 90% sure they were like paranormal, like ghost birds.
Well, listen, if there are ghosts, then there are ghost birds, and we can't fight that. We have to just be okay with that, radically accept it.
Just wait for Alex Garland's follow-up for A24, Ghost Bird.
Ghost birds. Okay. No, this might be before your time. Do you remember Dead Birds? Hold on, I have to look this up. Because Dead Birds was this amazing direct-to-video 2004 horror film, definitely by someone famous. Hold on a second. Does the name sound familiar to you? Oh, it's written by Simon Barrett. Yeah, I brought it up, so I should say what it's about. So Dead Birds centers on a group of deserters turned bank robbers who come face to face with supernatural forces while holding up in an abandoned plantation after robbing a bank. I just remember
That sounds
renting this with my
amazing.
dad as a kid. Yeah. I think I got to, yes, I definitely got to ask Simon Barrett about it on this podcast once. That was a big moment for me. Oh my God, it stars Henry Thomas. Got to revisit it. So yeah, that was my tangent on Dead Birds. I hope everyone enjoyed it. How would you feel if we finally got to our grand finale, the reason everybody's tuning in 28 months later?
Let's do it.
Sweet. So you may not know, this third film in the 28 trilogy has not actually been made, but has been in discussion since about 2007. So Fox Atomic spoke with Bloody Disgusting all the way back in 2007, where they first noted that a third film was on the table potentially. Also, same year, while promoting the movie Sunshine to MTV, Danny Boyle said that they had come up with a story for the film, unquote. There is an idea for the next one, something which would move the story forward. I've got to think about it, whether it's right or not. We skip ahead a few years to 2010, and writer Alex Garland was asked what was happening with what people were dubbing 28 months later, and this was his response. I'll answer that completely honestly. When we made 28 Days Later, the rights were frozen, and a group of people who are no longer speaking with each other are sort of holding the cards. And so the film is never going to happen unless those people start talking to each other again. There is no script as far as I'm aware. And I think he would be aware because I'm assuming he would have helped write it, hopefully, maybe. I'm really wondering who these people that were being so petty were, and if one of them was Danny Boyle. If you had to guess, do you think it would be anyone we would have known by name or just shadowy producers?
I would think shadowy, just behind the scenes producer.
It always is. It always is. So skip another year to 2011, and speaking with Empire Magazine, Danny Boyle said this. So there is a good idea for it when speaking about 28 months later. And once I've got my stage production of Frankenstein open, which, yes, I remember him doing, I'll begin to think about it more. He followed that up a couple years later saying, it's 40-60 whether a sequel happens or not, but we have an idea of where to set it and what it might be about. When someone asked him to sort of share the idea, he said no, because they'd end up stealing it for The Walking Dead, which is very funny and very, very sassy. In 2015, Garland spoke with IGN, and here's what he had to say. We just started talking about it seriously. We've got an idea. Danny Boyle and producer Andrew McDonald and I have been quite serious in conversations about it, so it's definitely a possibility. It's complicated. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it's complicated, which are boring and I won't go into, but there's a possibility. It's more like 28 months rather than 28 years. 28 months gives you more of a place to go. And then he was also continued to hint that maybe there'd be a fourth film, which I'm assuming would be 28 years later. Why not? 2019, Boyle told NME that he and Garland recently met to discuss this third film. The next year, and in 2021, Imogen Poots and Cillian Murphy both stated to NME that they would be really interested in reviving their personal roles from the first film and second film, which would be interesting to see come together. And then even like in the last couple of months, we had Garland speaking to Yahoo Entertainment, and he said this. It's possible. It's one of those things. Everybody needs to want to do it. And every now and then, partly because I think about paying off my mortgage or something like that, I think, that would be a good idea. But then, me personally, I never quite have enough motivation to follow through. The last quote I've got, which was, I believe, in the last couple of months, we have him saying, "A long time has passed, and 28 days later, when it arrived, it was fresh, and I don't think it's fresh anymore." I think it actually, in speaking of conversation, 28 days later joined the zombie conversation, that genre. It did its thing, which is great, and it was nice to be a part of that, really. And that's where we left off, which doesn't sound like the most positive place for this film. With all of that in mind, Chad, do you think we're ever going to get 28 months later, or even just a follow-up film?
So I will say, I always use the Scream franchise as a good metric. I never like to say never. I do like the sort of vacillations and those responses from like pretty optimistic to like, no, this is silly. Why would you ask about this? Of course it's not going to happen within, just a couple years time. So I wouldn't rule it out entirely. I think that especially with sort of like the digital convergence and streaming, we're seeing a lot of old properties resurrected in sometimes very unusual formats. I still think it's like the strangest but coolest thing that there was a Snowpiercer TV show.
Yeah, totally.
So I never like to count things out. There's always a chance.
Well, that's nice. And honestly, if it's going to make the money, it'll resurface in some way or form. I guess my follow-up question is, do we want to see more of the 28 universe? If you got to make the decision, would you say yes or no?
So if I got to make the decision, I would probably say no. And not that, like, in a personal sense, yes, I like all movies, and I'm also just the kind of person who likes things that I'm familiar with. So I would say this is something I recognize. I'm going to want to consume this thing. But I will say that, especially predicated on that last quote from Garland, it sort of has had its moments. And that's what's always tricky about these delays and not being really swift with getting something out, is that it has been almost superseded by a lot of new zombie efforts. We've had some really cool South Korean efforts with like Train to Busan and #Alive, which premiered on Netflix a few years ago. And so the genre is sort of already carving out its new landscape in this decade, that I think 28 months later would theoretically, it would need to have a really good idea, and it would really need to have something to say to justify its existence, because there is no dearth now of really good zombie movies, which I think, the original and even 28 weeks later had the advantage of coming at a fortuitous time where it still wasn't so big a subgenre, at least in the mainstream, that it was something that could stand out, hence why both of them did so well financially. I think it would have a harder time in this filmic landscape carving out its space to be seen and appreciated.
I agree with you completely. I don't know if it's something we need, and if it does come around, they better have a very fresh take, because it may just get drowned out with all the other sort of high quality genre stuff or even zombie stuff that we have. And you're right, especially from other parts of the world. Chad, if you were to be found on the internet, where could people find you?
I can be found on Twitter at @ChadIsCollins. I made this joke earlier and I'm going to make it again. There is an is between my name. Chad Collins is a pastor. He's a very nice guy, I'm sure, but he is not me.
Okay, this is good information.
I have had people go to follow me and they'll be like, you tweet some weird stuff. And I'll say, that's not me.
There's two different sides of you. Follow the correct Chad. Chad is Collins. Amazing. And I guess another question I have for you is, if someone was to read a recent article of yours, where would you direct them? What's something that we could look into?
So I would direct people toward Dread Central, of course. And I was really proud of that piece I did sort of on 28 Days Later about the history of fast zombies and the way that the zombie subgenre has sort of developed since the early aughts. So I was really proud of that one. I found some cool research. I thought I developed some really cool insights into sort of the development of the subgenre. So I would encourage people to check that out if you want more zombie fare. And there are some additional recommendations in there of some current zombie stuff that people might not have seen yet.
Well, you heard him, so we're going to link that in the episode description, so you should check that out right now. Chad, this was awesome. Thank you for coming back to Development Hell. It's always fun chatting with you.
Had a great time.
Thank you so much for listening to Development Hell. If you enjoy this podcast, then please do us a major favor of leaving us 5 stars and writing a positive review. It really makes all the difference in the world. We'll see you next week with a brand new episode of Development Hell.
Thank you for listening to the Dread Podcast Network.